Maggie the dinosaur. That's what they called her behind the nurse's station, whispered through smirks and phone videos that never quite made it to HR. The younger staff, the ones with TikTok followers and student loan forbearance plans, watched Margaret Walsh move through Sacred Heart's ICU at 3 in the morning like she was some relic they'd accidentally hired during the budget crisis of 2016. Middle-aged. Limping slightly on her left leg. Refilling ice chips at a pace that suggested she had nowhere better to be, which was technically true, though the reasons went much deeper than any of them could have guessed. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer above the patient beds, casting shadows under her eyes that hadn't fully lifted since the Obama administration. Antiseptic smell, that particular blend of bleach and sterility that hospitals pump into the air like it's oxygen, had long ago stopped bothering her. Her hands moved with precision as she checked the 4 lines on a dehydrated 73-year-old admitted with pneumonia, fingers steady as surgical lasers, adjusting the flow rate without hesitation. One of the residents watched her work and said nothing, which meant he understood that she knew more about trauma stabilization than he'd learn in the next 3 years of his career. But he wouldn't ask. Nobody asked the night nurse anything except where to find the crash cart. She kept her locker combination written in her palm. Not on paper, in her actual skin, blue ballpointing that she'd rewrite every few weeks. Room for 47B, the combination 19-23-4. Nobody noticed because nobody cared. Dr. Gregory Ashford, the hospital's chief of surgery and the kind of administrator who wore Italian leather shoes to morning rounds, had already noticed plenty. He was currently standing at the nurse's station making notes on his tablet about staff optimization opportunities, which was precisely what he called it when he wanted to fire someone and replace them with a per diem contractor earning $8 an hour. Margaret was 63 years old. Ashford was 39 and climbing. She was exactly the kind of obstacle that blocked his path to the executive suite. Margaret's fingers found the inside of her jacket lining twice during her shift, 0300 and 0600, both times during the quiet moments. The faded unit patch was still there, stitched into the fabric where nobody could see it. Delta Force. Operation Sanctuary. Bagram, 2019. The stitching was starting to fray. She'd been thinking about replacing it, but replacement felt like admitting something she wasn't permitted to admit. The patch stayed. It pressed against her ribs like a secret scar. The overhead page crackled at 0847. Her hands were replacing empty saline bags on the 4 pump station when the hospital intercom came alive with a voice that didn't belong to the regular daytime operator. Male. Military cadence. Incoming trauma. Delta Force Colonel. Catastrophic internal injuries. Requesting best trauma doctor available. ETA for minutes. All trauma personnel report to ICU now. Margaret's hands stopped moving. The bags hung suspended in her grip, still, weightless, forgotten. Her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat, the kind of breath that happens when your body recognizes danger before your mind catches up. For minutes. She had 4 minutes to become a different person, or 4 minutes to stay exactly where she was. The younger nurses were already moving, their voices bright with the kind of adrenaline that came from doing something important. Someone called for the crash cart to be positioned. Someone else was shouting about O2 setups and monitoring equipment. The ICU transformed in seconds from the quiet 0800 moment into something alive and purposeful. This was what they trained for. This was the moment the comfortable ones lived for. Margaret turned toward the ICU doorway. She could have stayed at the nurse's station. Should have stayed. The standing protocol was that veteran nurses handled the administrative side during traumas, and the trauma nurses did the hands-on work. She was 63 and limping. She could have made coffee. She could have pretended she didn't hear the page. Instead, her feet carried her toward the ICU doors. The gurney came through at 0851, preceded by a sore Night Stalker's transport team moving with the kind of fluid precision that came from having already survived the worst. The helicopter had put down on the hospital helipad 7 minutes earlier. Dust still clung to their uniforms. One of them had blood on his sleeves that wasn't his. Colonel James Riker lay on the gurney with his eyes closed and his chest wrapped in emergency field dressing, the kind of compression bandage you applied in the field when you didn't know if the next hour would be your last. His uniform was mostly shredded. His left arm hung across his abdomen like it didn't belong to him anymore. She knew that scar above his left eyebrow. She'd watched him get it in Kandahar during a convoy briefing when a piece of mortar shrapnel came through the tent flap. She remembered him not flinching, just touching his forehead and continuing the tactical overview like his own blood wasn't dripping onto his notes. Margaret froze in the ICU doorway. Her hands gripped the door frame. Not tightly. Just enough that someone watching her would notice the knuckles going white. 3 seconds. 4. Her eyes locked on Riker's unconscious face as 8 years of suppressed trauma surfaced like a body rising from deep water. 8 years since Bagram. 8 years since the court-martial hearing in that windowless room where he'd sat across from her with his jaw set and his eyes empty of recognition, reading from a document she'd never been allowed to see, delivering the verdict that ended her military career in 45 minutes and 3 seconds. She'd counted the seconds. Watched the clock on the wall. Wondered if the fluorescent lights in that room were the same brand they used in hospitals. They were. Dr. Gregory Ashford was standing at the trauma bay monitor station, and he was watching Margaret with the kind of cold calculation that made his mouth narrow into something approximating a smile. He saw a 63-year-old nurse hesitating in a doorway. He didn't see anything beyond that. Didn't see the way her breathing had shifted. Didn't see the color draining from her face in a pattern that suggested recognition rather than shock. Didn't see the faded unit patch pressing against her ribs like a physical thing. What he did see was opportunity. The trauma team was already deploying around the gurney, calling out vitals in that rapid-fire medical shorthand that sounded like a language nobody had formally taught but everyone understood. Blood pressure 78/52 and dropping. Heart rate 142, tachycardic. O2 sat 81%. Respiration shallow and rapid. The transport medic was speaking into Riker's ear like the colonel could still hear him, which was protocol even when you knew better. "Colonel, you're at Sacred Heart in San Diego. You're in good hands. We've got you." Margaret watched the transport medic's face. Young. Maybe 28. The kind of composure that came from having done this in actual combat zones, which meant the ICU probably felt safe to him. Easy. Just a patient with trauma injuries, not an impossible situation. Just another day at the hospital instead of another day at Bagram. Ashford moved toward the trauma bay with the kind of authority that came from knowing the board was always watching his cost-cutting initiatives, always ready to promote the next guy if he didn't keep showing results. This was his moment. A Delta Force colonel meant media presence. Meant a success story he could use for his next funding meeting. Meant staying relevant to the people who made decisions about his future at Sacred Heart. He didn't notice that Margaret still hadn't moved from the doorway. One of the attending physicians, Dr. Patricia Liu, second-year trauma specialist, was already pulling on sterile gloves, her movements sharp and economical. Type and cross, 8 units whole blood, CBC, CMP, lactate, coagulation panel. Get me a chest X-ray stat and prep for possible thoracotomy. I need imaging of the abdomen the second we're stable enough to move him. The nurses scattered into motion. The younger ones with energy and fresh legs. The ones who still believed in the mythology of the ER, that urgency cured everything, that speed solved impossibility, that shouting the right orders at the right moment could resurrect the dead. Margaret's hands released the door frame. She was supposed to go back to the station. She was supposed to begin the administrative cascade, calling the blood bank, alerting the OR, notifying the surgical team on call. She was supposed to do everything except walk into that trauma bay where Colonel James Riker lay bleeding out under fluorescent lights identical to the ones in the interrogation room where he'd ended her life. But her feet had already started moving. The room went dead silent for exactly 1 second. Not because of what she did, but because of the way she did it. The way 63-year-old nurses don't walk through trauma bays. The way her shoulders squared as she crossed the threshold. The way her limp seemed to vanish, replaced by something that looked less like injury and more like restraint. Dr. Ashford's eyes narrowed. There was his opening. The old nurse stepping out of line. Breaking protocol. Interfering with trained trauma staff. One more notation in the file he was building. One more piece of evidence for the termination he was already planning. Margaret didn't look at him. She looked at the monitors, at Riker's vitals climbing and falling like a graph of someone's life being decided in real time. Pressure dropping. Rate climbing. Oxygen saturation falling through the critical threshold. She looked at the trauma nurses moving around the bed with good intentions and incomplete training. She looked at Dr. Liu calling orders that were technically correct but strategically missing the actual problem. Riker's body was screaming. Tension pneumothorax, Margaret said. Not loud. Not a question. Dr. Liu looked up. Excuse me. His breath sounds are absent on the left. Pressure readings suggest build-up, not simple pneumothorax. Tracheal deviation starting. He needs needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Now. Before anything else. The room stayed quiet. Liu's hands paused over the chest dressing. The transport medic looked at Margaret with the expression of someone recognizing authority in a voice that didn't match its owner's seniority. Ashford's face darkened with the color of something about to erupt. Dr. Liu said, "That's my patient. I'll make those calls." Margaret nodded once. A small motion. Just a nurse acknowledging the doctor. Nothing more. Nothing that would appear in security footage or incident reports. Nothing that would give Ashford the ammunition he was so clearly hunting for. She turned and walked back toward the station. But she didn't leave the ICU. She stayed close enough to hear the silence that followed. Close enough to hear Liu calling for the needle. Close enough to hear the hiss of air escaping when it found the right space between Riker's ribs. Close enough to hear his oxygen saturation begin climbing again as his lungs re-inflated. 88, 91, 94, stable. 30 seconds later, Dr. Liu met her eyes across the room. A very small nod. The kind of recognition that passed between people who understood that medicine was partly science and partly something else entirely. Something that came from experience. From field work. From knowing what impossible looked like when it was lying on a stretcher bleeding out under fluorescent lights. Ashford was very still at the monitor station. His smile had faded. The overhead page crackled through every floor at 1,447 hours, and Margaret Walsh recognized the tone immediately, the one reserved for administrative summons, the kind that made junior staff lean in and whisper. Maggie the dinosaur to the administrator's office. Maggie the dinosaur. The nickname hung in the air like cigarette smoke, and snickers rippled through the break room where 3 night shift nurses were reviewing charts. Margaret didn't look up from the ICU monitor bank where she'd been tracking Colonel Riker's vitals, his oxygen saturation holding steady at 94, heart rate 82, blood pressure climbing back toward normal with each passing hour. She simply closed the file folder on the desk and stood, her movements carrying the weight of someone who'd learned long ago that the smallest gesture could be weaponized. The walk to the elevator felt longer than it should have. Her shoes, regulation black, broken in over 8 years of night shifts, clicked against the tile in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. 1-2. 1-2. Younger nurses watched from the supply station, their phones already out, probably texting in the group chat she wasn't part of anymore. They'd stopped inviting her to after-shift coffee 3 months ago, around the time Ashford had arrived from UCLA and started his campaign of quiet recalibration. Margaret had seen the type before, in the military. Officers who climbed by stepping on necks. Officers who smiled while they did it. The elevator doors opened on the 4th floor, and Dr. Gregory Ashford was waiting. Not by accident. He stepped from the alcove near the supply closet before she could reach the stairwell, a smooth, practice move, and his hand came up to block her path. Not aggressively. Just a subtle extension of his arm, a gesture that made it clear this wasn't a conversation happening in the hallway where witnesses could eavesdrop. The supply closet door was already open behind him. Oxygen tubing hung from hooks like snakes coiled in the shadows. The smell of disinfectant was thick, almost suffocating. "Margaret! I'm glad I caught you." His voice was calm, precisely modulated, the voice of a man who'd never had to raise his tone to be heard. His eyes were grey, not warm grey, but the grey of concrete, of something that reflected light but held no warmth within it. He wore his title like an expensive watch, the kind that told time and announced your net worth simultaneously. "We should talk about your future here at Sacred Heart." She didn't move. She didn't step back into the supply closet. She stood in the doorway between the fluorescent brightness of the hallway and the shadow of that small room, and she waited. It was a technique she'd learned in Bagram, in interrogation scenarios they'd run for combat medics. Silence creates pressure. Silence makes people fill the void. Ashford was no interrogator, though. He was something simpler, a predator who'd never been taught to fear the prey. "I've been reviewing your patient satisfaction scores." He stepped closer, and Margaret felt the air pressure change, the way it does when a storm moves in. "Concerning trends. Your bedside manner, Margaret. Some of the younger patients have noted that you seem, how do I put this, distant. Focused on procedure rather than care. It's outdated. This hospital is moving toward a new model, and frankly, I'm not sure you fit that vision." He paused, letting the words settle like sediment. "One more patient complaint, just one, and you're done here. We need team players, not relics taking up salary budget. Do you understand me?" Margaret took one measured breath. The kind of breath she'd taken before a combat insertion, before stepping into a room where people were dying. Her jaw tightened, just barely, a small muscle flexing near her temple, and she met his eyes without blinking. "Understood, doctor." Her voice came out level, without inflection, which somehow made it worse for him. She could see the frustration flash across his face, the micro-expression of a man expecting tears or anger and receiving neither. He'd wanted her to crumble. He'd choreographed this moment expecting a specific performance, and Margaret had refused to read her lines. A single tear escaped her left eye without permission. Not from sadness. From rage. The kind of rage that comes from holding 8 years of silence while a man half her age questioned her competence. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, a quick, efficient motion, and never broke eye contact. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of something being driven into stone. "Dignity isn't something you can reassign, doctor." She walked past him, not around him, stepping directly into his space in a way that forced him to step back. That was a small victory, the kind that wouldn't matter in the morning. She'd learned in the military that small victories were often all you had left. Her hand pressed against the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, a faded piece of fabric with a crossed sword and lightning bolt, the insignia of the 1st SFOD Delta, the unit that had erased her from existence. The patch was warm against her ribs, a reminder that she'd survived worse than an ambitious surgeon with a god complex. The next morning arrived in San Diego the way all mornings do, indifferent to human suffering. Margaret pulled into the Sacred Heart parking lot at 06:45, 15 minutes before her shift, watching the day staff filter in through the main entrance. The sun was just clearing the horizon, turning the asphalt the color of old blood. She grabbed her badge from the visor and stepped out into air that already felt too warm, the kind of heat that makes you understand why soldiers feared the desert. Her scrubs were still damp from the laundry. She'd run the wash twice because the first time hadn't felt clean enough. Dr. Ashford was waiting by the employee entrance, near the time clock, his white coat already on, his stethoscope draped across his shoulders like a python. He had his phone in one hand and his coffee, some expensive thing in a ceramic mug that probably cost more than Margaret's rent, in the other. He watched her approach with the patience of someone who'd already won the game. "Margaret!" He didn't wait for her to reach the door. He raised his voice, loud enough to carry across the parking lot where nurses and orderlies were unloading from their cars. Loud enough to make people stop and listen. We need to make some staffing adjustments. Effective immediately, you're reassigned to bedpan rotation on the geriatric ward. He delivered each word like a surgeon inserting a blade. We need our ICU resources focused on high acuity care, and frankly, your skill set is better suited to basic patient hygiene. 20 people heard him. 20 people watched Margaret's face. 20 people would carry this moment into break rooms and group chats, would repeat his words with the enthusiasm of gossip that tastes like justice. A young nurse from PEDS actually smiled. Someone else, Margaret thought it was one of the respiratory techs, pulled out their phone. Margaret's hands remained steady. They didn't shake. They didn't clench. They held the thermal cup of coffee she'd brought from home with the kind of calm that comes from having made impossible decisions before. Her face didn't change. Not a muscle moved except for her jaw, which tightened almost imperceptibly, and her eyes, which went flat, the kind of flat that comes from looking into a distance no one else in the parking lot could see. She'd learned that particular expression in Bagram, in the compound where her team had gone dark and never come back, in the moment when she realized that honor and rules could be erased as easily as classified files. "I'll report at 0700, Doctor." Her voice came out steady, clipped, stripped of any inflection that might suggest she felt anything at all. It was the voice of someone who'd given orders to Rangers and SEALs, the voice of someone who'd told a 19-year-old private his spine was severed and watched him nod and accept it. It was not the voice of a nurse who'd just been publicly humiliated in front of her colleagues. She walked toward the employee entrance without waiting for Ashford to respond. Her pace was unhurried, measured, the kind of walk that suggested nothing in the world had power over her direction. The coffee cup was warm in her hands. The patch was warm against her chest. And somewhere in the building behind her, Colonel James Riker was sleeping in an ICU bed, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision, his chart growing thicker with survival, with the slow accumulation of hours that meant he was going to live. Margaret didn't know yet what that meant. She didn't know that the moment she'd recognized him in that ICU doorway had set something in motion, something that moved through the hospital's infrastructure like a virus with an incubation period. She didn't know that Ashford had already made his 3 phone calls, one to HR citing performance concerns and scope of practice violations, one to Dr. Patricia Chen on the board who owed him a favor, and one to ICU scheduling to lock Margaret out of high acuity care permanently. She didn't know that her name had been removed from access protocols, or that her security badge would no longer open certain doors. What she knew was that she'd been given a new shift rotation. That she'd be changing bedpans for people who couldn't remember their own names. That Ashford had chosen public humiliation as his method because strategic competence was always scarier than rage, and Ashford was very, very competent. What she knew was that when she clocked in at 0700 and walked toward the geriatric ward, she would do the job exactly as it had been assigned to her, with the same precision she'd brought to combat medicine, because that was what soldiers did. They followed orders. They survived. They waited. And sometimes, they were right to wait, because the things that destroy kingdoms usually take their time. The geriatric ward at Sacred Heart ran on a different rhythm than the ICU. Slower. Quieter. The kind of place where time moved like honey through a syringe. Margaret pushed the bedpan cart down the corridor at 2,300 hours, her shoes whispering against linoleum worn smooth by 8 years of footsteps. Mr. Henriksen in 407 needed assistance. Mrs. Diaz in 409 was asking for her daughter again, the one who hadn't visited in 6 months. Margaret held her hand anyway, counting the pulse beneath paper-thin skin like it was the most important thing happening in San Diego that night. Which, for Mrs. Diaz, it was. The work was beneath her qualifications. Every molecule of Margaret's body knew it. Her hands, which had once inserted chest tubes under fire in Helmand Province, now adjusted incontinence briefs with the same meticulous care. Her eyes, trained to read vital signs the way other people read expressions, watched oxygen saturation numbers on monitors that nobody else in the ward seemed to actually look at. She noticed when Mrs. Chen's breathing pattern changed, not enough to alarm the day's shift, but enough that Margaret made a note. She noticed when Mr. Rodriguez's color shifted toward ashen, adjusted his positioning, ordered labs that turned up early sepsis markers. Silent interventions. Documented nowhere. Credited to no one. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that every single action, every redirect of a patient's hand away from a central line, every early mobilization that prevented pneumonia, every conversation that kept a dying man's mind tethered to the present, was being catalogued by someone who didn't understand the language she was speaking. Dr. Ashford's call to the ICU staff came through at 0630 on a Tuesday morning. Margaret was already gone, having worked the night shift and clocked out at 0600. The night charge nurse, Jennifer, had fielded it directly. The message was surgical in its precision. Margaret Walsh was no longer authorized for high-value patient assignments. Effective immediately, all scheduling changes would be processed through the Chief of Surgery's office. Anyone assigning her to Level 1 or Level 2 beds would be logged. No exceptions. Jennifer had stared at the phone after hanging up, then at the rotation board, then back at the phone. The board had already been adjusted, Margaret's name removed from every ICU shift for the next 6 weeks, replaced by names of travelers and newer hires who billed out at lower rates. The administrative sleight of hand was so clean, so perfectly justified within hospital policy, that it took her 3 minutes to realize she was looking at a premeditated action. Ashford made his first call at 0645. HR picked up on the second ring. "This is Dr. Gregory Ashford, Chief of Surgery." His voice carried the kind of flat authority that made people write things down. "I'm documenting a pattern of unauthorized medical procedures being performed by Margaret Walsh, RN, on Level 1 patients. She's operating significantly beyond her scope of practice. I have security footage. I need it formally logged with your department and her file flagged for investigation." The HR representative, a woman named Susan who'd worked in employee relations for 11 years, heard the calm precision in his tone and began typing immediately. Scope of practice violations weren't jokes. They were liability grenades. "Can you provide specific examples, doctor?" She performed an unauthorized assessment on a critical patient, identified pathology, and initiated treatment without physician authorization or supervision. "This happened during my shift. I have dates, times, and footage." What he didn't mention was that Margaret had just saved Colonel James Riker's life. The second call came at 0700, routed to the hospital board's finance committee chairman, a man named Sterling who'd been advocating for cost reduction for 2 years. Ashford kept this one shorter. "We've identified inefficiencies in nursing staffing that are going to help us meet the margin targets we discussed. Some of the older full-time RNs have become redundant. I'm documenting performance issues as we transition to the new model." Sterling smiled on his end of the line. He didn't ask questions. He already knew the answer to the one that mattered: how much money would this save? The third call went to a different department entirely, the one that handled credentialing and privileges. Ashford requested that Margaret's access to any procedure areas be revoked pending investigation of unauthorized medical procedures. The paperwork would take 48 hours to process. In the meantime, she would be scheduled only in non-critical areas. And with that, Margaret became a ghost in the hospital where she'd worked for 8 years. A presence that moved through corridors but touched nothing that mattered. She didn't know any of this yet. On Tuesday morning, after her shift ended, Margaret drove to the 7-Eleven on Mercy Boulevard and bought black coffee and a burrito that the clerk heated in the microwave. She sat in her 2004 Honda Civic in a parking lot and watched San Diego wake up, the sun climbing over the eastern hills like something alive and relentless. She'd slept for hours and felt it in her bones, that particular exhaustion that comes from holding yourself vertical for 12 hours when your body is screaming for horizontal. Her phone didn't buzz. Ashford wasn't stupid enough to tell her directly. That would have been confrontational. That would have required her to mount a defense. Instead, he was building an architecture of documentation, a paper fortress where every action was recorded and every outcome was predetermined. The following Thursday, Margaret checked the scheduling system during her break. She noticed the changes with the kind of stillness that comes before understanding. 6 weeks of ICU shifts, gone. Her name replaced by other names. All of them, she noticed, had higher dates within the last 18 months. All of them charged out at rates that were $8 to $12 per hour lower than hers. She closed the computer. She didn't call anyone. She didn't ask for clarification. She already knew the answer. Ashford had moved her. Not fired her, not yet. That came later, with more documentation, more paper, more justification. For now, he was just removing her from the board. Reducing her to bedpans and routine vitals and patients who were unlikely to have catastrophic complications that might reveal what Margaret actually was capable of. The irony was that she understood the strategy perfectly. It was how you dismantled someone in an institutional environment. You didn't do it with one blow. You did it with 1,000 paper cuts, each one individually defensible, each one building toward a narrative that looked, from the right angle, like performance management. Ashford had spent 43 minutes on Thursday reviewing the security footage from the ICU at 00 for 7 hours on the night Riker crashed. He'd watched Margaret move through the room, past the frozen younger nurses, past the charge nurse's warning, straight to his chest. He'd watched her hands work. Watched her improvise. Watched a 14-gauge angiocath needle slide into the second intercostal space with the kind of certainty that came from having done it before. Hundreds of times. The plastic wrapper from an MRE meal ration pulled from her locker, where was that from? Why was she keeping MRE packaging in her work locker? He'd paused the footage. Enhanced it. Watched her tape the seal in place with sterile precision while simultaneously speaking into the trauma phone with a voice that didn't belong to any nurse he'd ever managed. Then he'd made his calls. Margaret continued her work in the geriatric ward. She moved through the nights as if nothing had changed. She bathed Mr. Henriksen. She held Mrs. Diaz's hand. She noticed when Mrs. Chen's breathing pattern shifted again, more pronounced this time, and she spoke quietly to the night resident about it. The resident ordered more labs. They came back positive. Mrs. Chen was moved to acute care. Margaret's note on the chart was professionally neutral, patient presenting with increased respiratory effort and altered vital signs per nursing assessment. It was noted. Documented. Credited to no one. By the following Tuesday, there were 3 formal complaints in Margaret's file. None of them had been delivered to her directly. One alleged that she'd performed an unauthorized assessment. Another claimed she'd given medication instructions to a family member without physician authorization. She'd actually just explained how the heart medication worked, the same way she explained it to every family member who asked. The third complaint, filed by Ashford himself, stated that her pattern of scope of practice violations and insubordination had become a liability issue. The documentation was meticulous. Each complaint was dated. Each one was signed. Each one was technically defensible if you didn't ask too many questions about context or intent. And that's when the real nightmare began. The code blue alarm screamed from the ICU at 2,347 hours, 3 floors up, a zone Margaret's badge could no longer access. She was 8 floors down in geriatrics, changing bedpans for patients who'd forgotten their own names, when the intercom crackled, code blue, ICU Bay 4. Trauma response, all hands. Her hands went still. The sponge in her grip dripped brown water onto linoleum. She didn't move for exactly 2 seconds. Then her feet did what her mind wasn't allowed to do anymore. The stairwell door slammed behind her. No elevator, too slow, too documented. Stairs meant no security footage in the blind spot between the second and third landings. Her scrubs whispered against the concrete walls as she climbed 3 flights, muscle memory overriding the reassignment order, the access restriction, the yellow badge that no longer meant anything. Her badge meant bathrooms and supply closets now. Her badge meant irrelevance. The ICU doors hissed open to chaos, the kind of chaos that had a rhythm if you'd learned to read it. A resident was doing chest compressions, counting aloud in the robotic cadence of someone who'd trained on mannequins. A nurse struggled with the defibrillator pads. The attending surgeon hadn't arrived yet. And on the bed, Colonel James Riker lay with his chest wound open to the fluorescent lights, bleeding out in the space between competence and disaster, and nobody in that room knew the difference between those two things. Margaret moved like the air had changed density. Like gravity was a suggestion she'd learned to ignore in places where suggestions could get you killed. Left anterolateral position, open wound, she said. Not a question. The resident stopped counting. Who the hell? Margaret was already at the locker, her hands finding what she'd kept for 8 years as a bitter keepsake, a salvaged MRE package from a field trauma in Loga province, the metallic foil wrapper still pristine, still wrapped in her pocket against regulations, against protocol, against everything she was supposed to be anymore. Pain was information. Information kept people alive. The wrapper became a seal under her palms in the space of 3 heartbeats. Vaseline from the first aid kit, pressed around the edges of the ruptured wound. She held it there, her hand steady as surgical lasers, as the kind of steady that comes from having already survived the worst this world had to offer. Pressure dressing. Occlusive. Now. A nurse moved without asking. Margaret's voice had authority that no badge could grant. O2 sat. 68. Climbing or dropping? Dropping. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath, needle decompression, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Someone call the attending. Tell him we're running out of time. She didn't look at Riker's face. Couldn't. The recognition lived in her peripheral vision like a bomb with a ticking clock inside her chest. 18 years. 8 years since Bagram. 8 years since he'd sat across from her in a closed-door hearing and signed the paperwork that made her disappear. The surgical team arrived 4 minutes later. Margaret stepped back. Her work was done. The moment the attending surgeon entered, a competent man named Brennan, grey-haired, no nonsense, she became invisible again. Just another nurse. Just someone who knew things she wasn't supposed to know. She walked down to the supply closet on the 3rd floor. The one with the broken lock. She sat in the dark among the 4 poles and sterile gauze and let her hands shake for exactly 90 seconds. Then she folded them in her lap and counted her breathing until the tremor stopped being about fear and became something else entirely. Became information again. Dr. Ashford watched the security footage at 0600 the next morning with a smile spreading across his face like a predator catching the scent of blood. There it was. Margaret Walsh, unauthorized access to the ICU. Margaret Walsh, performing emergency procedures beyond her scope of practice. Margaret Walsh, contaminating the sterile field with field trauma techniques that belonged in war zones, not hospital settings. His 3 phone calls had been precautionary. This was confirmation. He made 3 more phone calls before Margaret's shift started. One to HR with the security footage attached and a memo marked urgent. One to the credentialing board citing dangerous practices that violated patient safety protocols. One to the hospital administrator's office requesting an immediate termination meeting. By the time Margaret clocked in at 1,400 hours, the paperwork was already moving through channels, each signature a nail, each timestamp a lock. She saw the notice taped to her locker before she saw anything else. The paper was official, hospital letterhead, the administrator's signature already dry. Termination notice. Effective immediately. Unauthorized medical procedures beyond scope of practice. Security will escort employee from premises. She read it twice. Her hands didn't shake. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in plastic, and somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped its steady electronic rhythm, and neither of those things had changed from 5 minutes ago when she was still employed. The world kept going. That was the thing nobody told you about being erased. The world didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. Margaret. Ashford's voice came from behind her, the kind of voice a man uses when he's won and wants everyone in the corridor to know it. We need to talk. She turned. Her locker was still open, displaying the contents of 8 years, the cracked mug that read "World's Okayest" nursed in fading letters, a succulent with brown leaves curling inward like giving up made a sound, and a photograph in a plastic frame, 12 operators in combat fatigues, standing in front of a Black Hawk helicopter in the Loga Valley, dust everywhere, sun so bright it washed the color from their skin. Only 3 of them were still alive. All of them were supposed to be dead. You violated direct orders. Performed procedures you have absolutely no credential for, Ashford was saying, and his voice was the voice of a man whose entire worldview depended on the hierarchy of things. Doctors above nurses. Administrators above doctors. Rules above everything. You endangered a patient. You contaminated a sterile field. And you did it in direct violation of the ICU access restrictions I personally placed on your file. Margaret took the mug out of her locker. Set it in a cardboard box that hadn't existed 5 minutes ago but which she now found herself holding. You're a liability we can't afford, Ashford continued, and now there was an edge in his voice, a slight tremor that suggested he'd expected her to cry or defend herself or exhibit some kind of emotional response that would validate his narrative. And frankly, no one will believe a word you say about your qualifications. You're just a nurse. A night shift nurse. Someone nobody even remembers. She placed the photograph in the box. Then the succulent, dirt spilling from its pot in small red clouds. Her hands were still steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It wasn't weakness. It was restraint, the kind of restraint that had kept her alive in places where the unburdened would have died screaming. I understand, doctor, she said quietly. 8 words. Maximum impact. 2 security guards appeared, young men, early 20s, the kind who'd joined the force because the job seemed straightforward and nobody had told them that straightforward was a lie you told yourself before the world got complicated. They wouldn't meet her eyes. They'd been ordered not to meet her eyes. The parking lot was empty when Margaret walked through it at 1,430 hours, the cardboard box balanced on her hip, her wet scrubs clinging to her skin like the hospital was trying to leave fingerprints on her. Rain started as she reached the bus stop on Mercy Boulevard. Not drizzle. Rain the way it falls when the sky has given up negotiating. It soaked through the cardboard, turning the photograph soft at the edges, the faces of those 12 operators bleeding slightly at the corners. She didn't move. Didn't pull her jacket closed. Didn't protect the box. The bus pulled up 14 minutes later, and the driver, a woman with tired eyes who'd seen 1,000 people board her bus looking like they'd been running from something, didn't ask questions. Margaret sat in the back row. The box sat on her lap. The faded unit patch remained where it had lived for 8 years, sewn into the lining of her jacket, pressed against her ribs like a secret scar, like a name she couldn't say out loud anymore, like proof that Major Margaret Walsh had once existed in a world that no longer acknowledged she'd ever been there at all. The apartment was dark except for the glow of rain against the window. Margaret sat motionless on the edge of her bed, still in damp scrubs that clung to her skin like a second failure, the cardboard box balanced on her lap. Inside, a cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, a dying succulent with brown leaves curling inward like surrender, and a photograph so worn the creases had become permanent, her Delta team before Bagram, before everything classified, before the mission that erased them all. Her hand trembled as it moved to her jacket lining, finding the faded unit patch sewn there 8 years ago, the stitching tight enough to hold secrets. The jacket hung in her closet like a ghost of a woman who no longer existed. At 1900 hours exactly, the apartment door exploded open. Danny, 17 years old, breathless, his eyes wild with the kind of fury only a son feels when watching his mother disappear. He held the shadow box, the one she'd kept locked in the attic, the one she'd hidden from everyone, the one that held the proof. The cardboard box tumbled from her lap. Margaret moved to reach for him, but he was already speaking, his voice cracking like ice under pressure. Mom, they need to see these. You can't let him win. Danny. The board meeting. Right now. He's there. The board's there. News cameras too. He called them himself to tell them he fired you for being incompetent. They're still broadcasting. Mom, we have to go. Now. 30 minutes later, the hospital boardroom fell silent when Danny pushed through the double doors, the shadow box open in his shaking hands. The assembled directors turned, 7 faces, the hospital administrator in the center, Dr. Ashford standing near the projection screen where his performance review had been playing. News cameras swung toward the boy. Danny's voice cut through the moment like a scalpel through sternum. "My mother is Major Margaret Walsh." He opened the box wider. Even from the back row, the medals caught light, ribbons in precise military colors, each one representing something earned, something lived, something that mattered. The camera operators pushed closer. One director leaned forward. The hospital administrator's face went pale. "Silver Star." Danny held it up. His voice steadied as it found authority. "Bronze Star with Valor." Another pause. The cameras captured everything. Ashford's mouth opened and closed. "Purple Heart." Two of them. From the back of the room, a voice emerged, not loud, but the kind of quiet that commands absolute attention. A Navy SEAL commander in civilian clothes, shoulders broad enough to make the room feel smaller. He'd flown in on his own dime after hearing Colonel Riker's debriefing, after learning what really happened in Kandahar, after understanding the cover-up that had buried a major's career. Major Walsh performed the Bagram extraction that saved 17 operators including Colonel Riker. Each word fell into the silence like a heavy thing. She earned the Defense Superior Service Medal. She was placed in witness protection after exposing a CIA cover-up that reached above the colonel's pay grade. Everything Dr. Ashford said about her is a lie. The hospital administrator picked up a file with trembling fingers, Margaret's declassified records, released that afternoon through Pentagon channels. His voice shook as he read, "Silver Star. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart, twice. Defense Superior Service Medal." This woman saved the lives of 17 military personnel in hostile territory. He looked at Ashford. "You fired her." The news cameras were still rolling. The upload bar on 3 different stations showed the footage going live across San Diego, across the state, as a Pentagon spokesman called into the evening news to clarify that Major Margaret Walsh, a decorated combat medic whose records had just been declassified, was a decorated hero. And within that same broadcast window, the station replayed Ashford's statement from earlier that day, an unqualified nurse who endangered a war hero. The contrast was immediate. Brutal. Permanent. Margaret watched it all from her darkened apartment, Danny beside her, neither of them speaking, just watching the pivot. The news cycle moved like predators scenting blood. Within 90 minutes, Ashford's phone exploded with calls, the hospital board demanding his immediate presence, the state medical board opening an investigation, 3 newspapers requesting comment on wrongful termination of a military hero. His carefully constructed narrative collapsed in real time, each fact falling like a domino he'd arranged himself. By 2200 hours, the emergency board meeting had reached its conclusion. Margaret and Danny sat in the hallway outside in damp scrubs and college acceptance hoodie, listening to raised voices vibrate through the walls. Ashford's protests about protocol and unauthorized procedures became quieter, then non-existent. The SEAL commander's testimony had already reached the board members' phones via leaked video, the kind of leak that comes from someone who respects the truth more than institutional politics. At 23:15, the board chair emerged. Ashford followed behind, his carefully styled hair disheveled, his tablet clutched against his chest like armor that no longer fit. The chair looked directly at Margaret. "Dr. Ashford, effective immediately, you are suspended pending investigation." "Margaret, we owe you an apology that words cannot adequately convey." Ashford passed her in the hallway. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. Margaret stood, took one measured breath, the same measured breath she'd taken after every humiliation, every insult, every moment of erasure, and said nothing. Her silence was louder than any accusation, more devastating than any accusation, the kind of silence that comes from someone who no longer needs to defend themselves. Security escorted him toward the exit, past the emergency department doors, past the ambulance bay where Margaret had stood 8 hours earlier in the rain. The next morning, when Colonel Riker woke in the ICU, his breathing stable on 2 liters of supplemental oxygen, his chest wound closed and holding, he asked the nurse, "The woman who saved me. Where is she?" When they told him Margaret Walsh, he closed his eyes. His voice broke, actually broke, like something wounded trying to heal. I need to speak with her. I need to explain what happened in Kandahar. I need to tell her the truth about why I did what I did. 6 months later, Margaret Walsh walked through Sacred Heart's main entrance at 06 for 5 hours, her new security badge reading Director of Trauma Services in raised letters, her new office waiting 3 floors up. The overnight security guard at the desk stood when she approached, came to something like attention. Dr. Gregory Ashford in an ill-fitting security uniform, his medical license suspended, his board positions revoked, his career incinerated across every major news outlet, his only option minimum wage at the hospital he'd once tried to run. His eyes stayed fixed on his folded hands as she passed. She didn't acknowledge him. Some people don't deserve that. In her new office, the faded unit patch was now framed on the wall beside a photograph of Danny at college orientation, both of them finally allowed to stop hiding. Colonel Riker had visited last month, walking with a cane, to personally apologize for the court-martial he'd been ordered to bury Operation Sanctuary by officers who were now under investigation. He couldn't tell her then, bound by the same classification that had erased her. They sat in her office for an hour, 2 soldiers who'd survived the same fire and didn't need to say much. The silence between them was different now. It was peace. Her first staff meeting as director included the nurses who once called her dinosaur. They wouldn't meet her eyes. Margaret addressed them calmly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen worse than incompetence, who'd saved lives in languages those younger nurses would never speak. Competence isn't loud. Experience isn't always visible. And the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. She touched the framed patch once, a ritual she no longer hid. The nurses felt the shift in air pressure, the way her presence had changed. Major Margaret Walsh was home. Subscribe for more stories where the quiet ones turn out to be the strongest ones. Like this video if you believe in fighting for what's right, even when no one's watching. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?